Good evening, everyone. We are now in chapter 15 in the book of Leviticus. One important point that we constantly need to be reminded and we have to keep in mind is that all this discussion from chapter 8 onwards has to do with clean and unclean. Clean being taher and unclean being tameh. The very purpose of these distinctions is to do with approaching God, drawing near to God, coming near to God. And that would mean that for a man or a woman to come to the tabernacle or the temple, the guardian of the temple or the tabernacle would be Aaron and his sons, the priesthood, the Kohanim. And they are the ones now being charged to determine if a person is clean or unclean and to teach the children of Israel the same. It is important for the children of Israel then to understand and realize why the priests would stop them from doing certain things and would pronounce certain people to be clean and unclean, and to invoke certain rituals for a person who is declared unclean, what to do to become clean again. Now, to become clean again, obviously, there are things to wash, immerse, clean, purify, but it's a ritual. And the Kohanim, the priesthood, are not doctors. They don't prescribe medication, but they inspect. And in their inspection, declares whether a person is taher or tameh. And the rituals to do that. And then you will find that it is a sin. And so a sin offering, a khatat, is brought. It is a sin because the person has missed being clean. And so once a person has gone through purification process and the offerings for the sin offering and perhaps uh, a asham, a transgression offering, uh, and also an olah. And so we can see that all kinds of uncleanness are being discussed. And today in chapter 15, we are talking about bodily discharge. It says, and then Jehovah spoke to Moses and Aaron and said this: Speak to the children of Israel and say to them. We begin here by discussing the man. And in this case, when it says man, it really means a male gender. So when any man that has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. This is tameh. So we can see this immediately. This is to do with clean and unclean. When he talks about a discharge, it is something that flows out or is emitted from the body, and it either gush out or flow out, and it's being discussed as an issue. And so the verb is zuf and the noun is zof. Now I highlight this to you is that one is a noun, one is a verb, and it is this kind of a discharge, the zof, that causes a person to be declared as unclean. In this particular context, in chapter 15, whenever we talk about his body or her body, this is not talking about a boil, but the sexual organ. So any form of discharge from a male, and then later we will talk about a female, is considered unclean. Now, in this case, you find that this uncleanness is minor. So there are minor and major tame. The minor ones would be unclean for the day until the evening. The major one would require 7 days for an inspection. And then there are those that will require another 7 days, as we have seen in the Zara. And then those who are permanently or a long term uh, suffering of some of these skin diseases, then it would be important for that person to live alone. Now, all of these has to do with what comes out of the body. And so in this case, it is what we call a minor discharge or minor uncleanness. And this shall be his uncleanness in regard to his discharge, whether his body runs with his discharge, his body is stopped up by his discharge, it is his uncleanness. Meaning, whether it flows out or whether it is stuck. This is what it means. His body stopped, his body runs. This is in Hebrew, please remember that the description that we always read would be something that could be visually inspected. When it is visually inspected, you'd find that his body runs, and this word here would be flow out, and then his body stops. His body stops means it's sealed up, which means that it's thick and it cannot be flowed out, or you can't see it flowing out. It is stuck in our terminology. So this flows, this is stuck. And in this regard, in chapter 15, is considered his uncleanness. It is tame. But what is interesting is in the Eastern Oriental view, anything that is tame, that he touches, he wears as his garments, he sits, anything that is within his, uh, I guess, proximity of touching or lying or wearing is really considered unclean. So in chapter 15, now in verse 4, for example, it begins to say, every bed is unclean on which he who has the discharge when he lies down to sleep. When he sits down, that is also unclean. Then you see that whoever touches his bed, you need to wash his clothes and bathe in water. And this idea of bathe in water is immerse. And be clean until evening. So this is what we call a minor uncleanness. He who sits on anything on which he who has the discharge sat shall immerse. These are all the same idea. His clothes and bathe in water, immerse by immersion, and will be unclean until evening. So the one who has a discharge, the one who touches the places he sits, the one who touches the body of him who has the discharge, shall also do the same, immerse his clothes and wash it clean, immerse in water and bathe clean, and be unclean until evening, together with the person who has a discharge. If he who has a discharge spits on him who is clean, meaning the person who maybe he's talking to the person, and for some reason he spits on him and he touches the spittle. The person who gets the spittle is also unclean, and he'll wash his clothes by immersion and bathe in water by immersion, be unclean until evening. Any saddle on which he sat, where he rode on, will be unclean. And so whoever touches anything that was under him where he sat shall be unclean until evening. He who carries any of those things shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, all by immersion, and be unclean until evening. Verse 11, and whomever the one who has the discharge touches and has not rinsed his hands in water, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, all by immersion, and be unclean until evening. The vessel of earth, the earthen vessel that he who has the discharge touches shall be broken, cannot be reused. It is by Torah. And every vessel of wood shall be rinsed in water, also immersed. Now, understand that so far we have dealt with 12 verses. This is what we call minor uncleanness. It's just minor. You're just uh, unclean until evening for the rest of the day. But when it is a major, there will be a difference, and we will be able to read that. In verse 13, and when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, cleansed meaning he does not have a discharge anymore, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe in running water, and then he shall be taher. Now understand this. He who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge. So from the male sexual organ, if the discharge stops. Now, what is the purpose of this discussion? It is on a daily basis if there is still discharge and that person is considered unclean until evening. And if he still has, he is still considered unclean until the next evening, until the time where he has no more discharge. Cleanse here is no more discharge. Now, why is this important? Is because this one here could be uh, an infectious disease. It is an infectious disease for various reasons. And it could be a cause by sexual disease or of some form of an inflammation inside the body. And the priest doesn't do that kind of a diagnosis. It is the doctors who has to do it. But to the priest and to the person who has a discharge, he is considered unclean. And so what we are reading here is not a medical prognosis. What we are reading here is just a visual understanding that as long as the man, the male, has some form of a discharge, whether it's flowing or whether it's stuck somewhere in the sexual organ, that person is unclean. And the day that his discharge of any form is stopped, then he has to give himself 7 days of observation for his cleansing. And this is to show that he is truly clean. And when he has done his 7 days and there is still no discharge, then he's got to wash himself, his clothes, and then he shall be pronounced clean. So this is what it means. He shall be taher, he will be pronounced clean, and just like all who has a skin disease, look at what he has to do. On the eighth day, which is after, on the eighth day, not the seventh, but on the eighth day, the day after his 7 days is over, he shall take for himself two turtle doves or two young pigeons, come before God and to the door of the tabernacle of a meeting. And when the temple is around to the temple, he is to come to God to, to finish the ritual of cleansing. Give it to the Kohen. The priest shall offer them one as a chatat. It is a sin because he is unclean. Could be minor, could be major. It is not as major as a zara, but it is major enough to warrant a waiting time until his discharge is over. The other bird as a burnt offering, and the burnt offering is an olah as a thanksgiving. And then the priest shall make atonement for him before God because of his discharge. And this discharge caused him to be unclean. So you see, atonement as a covering is to actually settle an issue that God has decided that it's important that you can't come. And if you do come, you need to settle that issue. So atonement is for sins, and this has nothing to do with moral. Understand that sin is really missing the mark, missing the mark of being clean. And so for some reason, he has a discharge. He was unclean. He is now gone through the process of purification. And so a khatat is offered to atone for his sin. And his sin is uncleanness due to discharge. In verse 16, there is a different form of discharge being discussed here. It says here, if any man, and this is the male, has an emission of semen. The Hebrew word here, because this emission of semen is modern day, the Hebrew word is an emission of seed from sex. If there is such a situation, it's a discharge. He shall wash all his body in water and be unclean until evening. This is a minor uncleanness. This is different from the earlier part where every day he is considered unclean until he has no more discharge. And so the standard minor discharge or minor uncleanness is very much for the day when you have touched a dead carcass or the carcass, a dead body of an unclean animal, unclean until evening. Emission of semen, unclean until evening. Any discharge, unclean until evening. But if he still continues, it's unclean until the evening. And so unclean until no discharge. In verse 16 onwards, it is very specific kind of a discharge. And in this case, any garment, any leather which there is such a discharge shall be washed with water by immersion, be unclean until evening. Even the garment is unclean, the leather is unclean, or the skin is unclean. Also, because it is from this act of sex, then a woman who lies with a man, and this is a euphemism, this is sex. Our modern day is sex, but this is a euphemism because the Hebrew uses a very soft word. This word actually means lie down. to lie down. And so it is a euphemism for sex as we understand it today. And when a woman lies with a man and there is an emission of semen, which is exactly the same, a discharge, seed from this act, they shall bathe in water and be unclean until evening. So it is a minor unclean, which means that in this case, they can't approach God. That's all. Now, in verse 19, it is a totally different situation that we are presented. It is with regards to the woman. And this, in this case, it would be the female. If the female has a discharge, a flow, and the discharge from her body is blood. Now, again, from the body, it is the sexual organ. And there is blood flowing. And for a woman, it is always a quarantine of 7 days. This word here in verse 19 literally means to be set apart 7 days. The word here is set apart. I think set apart is a good word, but the idea here is set apart to be alone. Be alone. And this discharge is considered what we call the regular impurity. Let me just put this down. This is the regular impurity of what we would call the menstruation. And if there is such a case, then it is a 7 day impurity. And in Eastern Oriental practice, whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. And so there is a minor uncleanness for anyone who touches a woman who is considered unclean. And in this case, because of menstruation, everything she lies on during her impurity. This word here is nida. Now, nida is the menstruation impurity. Shall be unclean. Whatever she touches, meaning she lies on, she sits on, is considered tameh. Whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. So there is an importance of cleaning himself. So it could be the husband, it could be a son, it could be a brother, but whatever it is, as long as it's a person who takes care of the house or cleans a place and touches things that she has touched. And whoever touches anything that she sat on shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean until evening. If any is on her bed or anything on which she sits and he touches it, he will be unclean until evening. Now, if any man lies with her at all, now this word here, any man lies with her, means have sex with her during her menstruation, then her menstruation blood is on him. He shall be unclean 7 days, like her, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. So we have a case of minor by touching, and then we have a case of major by engaging in sex with a woman who is having menstruation. Verse 25. Now, from verse 25 onwards, it is now a situation of unusual discharge. So if a woman has discharge of blood for many days, other than at the time of her impurity, which means her menstruation. So a menstruation is a regular thing, and this is an irregular discharge. Now, anything that is unusual, irregular, whether men or women, is considered unclean. And the reason being is that, remember, the priests are not doctors. They are not here to determine what is the cause of the discharge. But in the law of discharge, as long as there is and it is unusual, then the person is considered unclean. It runs beyond her usual time of menstruation, that all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her impurity. Meaning, as long as she is having the discharge, like the period of menstruation, all the days shall be treated like menstruation. She shall be tameh, unclean. So as long as there is discharge of blood, for whatever the reason, it could be an unusual menstrual flow, or it could be some uh, illness of sorts or some inflammation of sorts. The priests really do not diagnose the causes. The priest merely declares clean or unclean. And so the woman and the man needs to know every bed which she lies, all the days of her discharge shall be like the days of her menstruation. Like wherever she sits is unclean, as the uncleanness of her menstruation. Whatever she touches, those things will be unclean. The person shall wash his clothes, bathe in water by immersion, and be unclean until evening. And so now it comes to a point in time where her discharge ends. So if she is cleansed of her discharge, which means that her flow ends, there is no more flow, then we are told that she shall count for herself 7 days. That's the standard. Give it another 7 days to observe. And after that, she will be clean. After that 7 days, and on the eighth day, she comes, brings two turtle doves or two young pigeons, bring them to the priest, to the door of the tabernacle of meeting to complete the ritual of cleansing, the ritual of purification. The priest shall offer one as a chatat, the other as an olah. So we have this as a khatat and the other as an olah, as a thanksgiving. And the priest shall make atonement for her before Jehovah for the discharge of her uncleanness. So understand this. Her uncleanness discharge, her flow, makes her unclean. And the process or the ritual of cleansing or purification needs to complete by an atonement. It is not a moral atonement. It is, as I mentioned earlier on for the man, it is the completion, the covering of the matter, right? The covering of the matter. And this matter is the blood flow. For the man, it is his discharge. And I think eventually we'll get the point. Atonement is the settling of an issue. So let me just put it here. Atonement is really a settlement or a covering of an issue, whatever that issue may be. It could be moral, it could be physical, uh, in the form of uncleanness. As long as there is an issue that God has, that requires atonement, and so it needs to be done. It is to complete the process so that there is peace. And so there is a atonement made for her. We come to the end of our chapter. In this way, you shall separate. Now, understand this, separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness. This word here is Nazar. The idea of Nazar, Nazar, is used in two forms. In a general form, is to separate oneself. It's to um, be set apart. So set apart doesn't necessarily have only positive meaning. There is a negative meaning. It is merely to set apart, because if there is uncleanness, this person has to be alone, quarantine, and hence the word set apart, nazar, from the root word of the Nazarite. Lest they die in their uncleanness. Now, why would they die in their uncleanness? Because if they are unclean, they cannot come to the tabernacle, because they will defile my tabernacle that is among them. This is the Torah. God is very serious, because anyone who comes with a discharge could be having a transmittable disease. And then when there are so many people coming to the tabernacle, then everybody will get a transmittable disease. And so one of the things that the priest has to do is to determine, once it's unclean, set apart, keep that person by himself or herself. And for him who emits semen is unclean thereby. And so God makes it a point that even in a normal sexual act, it is considered unclean. And so God doesn't want anyone who has conducted such an event to come to the tabernacle until the next day. And so for her who is indisposed because of her menstruation, and which is normal for a woman, that person or that woman is unclean. For one who has a discharge, and this will be the regular menstruation, or a minor discharge of a semen or a menstruation, whether man or woman, and for him who lies with her is unclean. So, for a woman who has menstruation, and if she has sex with a man, both of them are considered unclean. Now, what is the point here as we come to a close? God says that this is a law. It means that it is serious for everyone to pay attention, because they might die in their uncleanness. God has declared the tabernacle is the place where he is present. And he wants the children of Israel to respect and be very clear that there is boundaries between man and God. And God wants certain rules to be followed. And if man does not follow the rules, God says they will defile my tabernacle. The idea of defile my tabernacle literally means to make unclean. God's place is always clean, and God only wants clean things. And so if a person is unclean, the things that he touches is considered unclean. And so a person who touches those things would be unclean. And so if this person comes to the tabernacle, he would make the entire tabernacle unclean because the person would be touching things. And so God says that person will die because that person is trivializing a holy God, is making God, the special God, the holy God of Israel, the Elohim of Israel, as nothing and can be contaminated by his or her uncleanness. And just like Nadav and Avihu, God told the priests not to burn any incense that God did not tell them to do. And when they did, they made the place unclean. They defiled God. They mistreated God's holy sanctuary. And so, what did God do? The sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, God sent fire and burnt them up. God is a serious God. God is not a trivial God. God doesn't want his people to trivialize him. God wants to give all these rules. Remember, God's house, God's rules, so that the Israelites may understand and appreciate who is man and who is God. It is that important. These are things which traditional Eastern Oriental culture people understands very well. And so you find that when people enter into a sacred house, like a temple of sorts, they will treat that as a very somber, sober, and serious event. And so here, God defines what he wants. And so if a person is unclean and ignores this, the person can die. That is a threat, definitely, because when a person contaminates God's presence, contaminates God's house, what does that make God? Not holy. And anyone who makes God not holy tantamounts to die. And that would be how serious God is to warn all the children of Israel. And when a person is unclean, make sure that person stays away from everybody else, not just God, everyone else, so that the person who engages with them is also unclean and shall also be considered unclean until the end of the day. So unclean people are what the Kohen will declare. And in those cultures, unclean means stay away. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.